The snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes outside the Hotel d'Angleterre, as though Copenhagen itself hesitated to reveal its secrets. In the royal suite, beneath a chandelier worth a king's ransom, Countess Ingrid von Rosenkjaer lay dead upon a chaise longue of pale blue silk. Her famous diamond tiara, the Tiara of Trembling Hands, so called because its 37 stones quivered like frightened fingers, rested perfectly upon her golden hair. Yet her own hands were clenched in rigor, the fingernails blue, the lips violet. No mark upon the body, no sign of struggle. Only a faint scent of bitter almonds lingering in the air, and a single white gardenia crushed beneath her heel. Chapter 1. The Woman Who Died Beautifully. The Snow over Copenhagen. That April morning of 1936 fell with the languid grace of a funeral veil, each flake drifting past the windows of the Hotel d'Angleterre, as though reluctant to touch the earth. Inside the royal suite on the third floor, beneath a chandelier of Bohemian crystal that scattered pale northern light into 1,000 shivering shards, Countess Ingrid von Rosenkjaer lay upon a chaise longue of ice blue silk, arranged with the meticulous composure of a Renaissance martyr. Her golden hair, still coiled in the elaborate braids she had worn to the charity ball the previous evening, framed a face that death had rendered even more beautiful than life. The skin translucent as Sèvres porcelain, the lips curved in a faint, almost amused smile, the eyes half closed beneath lashes heavy with last night's mascara. Upon her brow rested the famous Tiara of Trembling Hands, 37 flawless diamonds suspended in a lattice of platinum so delicate that every breath of air had once made the stones quiver like living things. They quivered no longer. Hercule Poirot stood just inside the doorway, gloved hands clasped behind his back, his immaculate overcoat still flecked with snow from the short walk across the Kongens Nytorv. He surveyed the scene with the solemnity of a priest entering a crypt. The room smelled faintly of tuberose and something sharper, more medicinal. Beneath it, the ghost of bitter almonds. Cyanide, his little grey cells whispered at once. Yet there was no glass, no spilled powder, no visible instrument of death. Only perfection. The windows sealed against the Danish winter, the door bolted from within, the key still in the lock on the inside. A suicide, the hotel manager had stammered. A tragedy. But Poirot's moustache, that magnificent edifice of vanity and precision, bristled with immediate disagreement. Suicide does not smile. Suicide does not arrange its diamonds so becomingly. Inspector Knud Larsen of the Copenhagen Politi loomed behind him like a worried bear in a brown tweed suit 2 sizes too small. His fair hair was damp with perspiration despite the chill. Great men made him nervous, and Poirot, though scarcely 5'4", was indubitably great. Larsen cleared his throat. She was found at 7 by the chambermaid, Astrid Jensen. The husband, Count Karl, occupies the adjoining bedroom. He is unwell, confined to a wheelchair. He swears he heard nothing. The maid screamed. The night porter forced the communicating door from the Count's side, and here we are. Larsen gestured helplessly at the serene corpse. No note, no weapon, no disturbance. The hotel physician says heart failure, but I telephoned for a toxicologist all the same. Poirot did not answer immediately. He advanced with small, deliberate steps, the carpet, his patent leather shoes making no sound. He paused beside the body, tilted his head first to one side, then the other, exactly as a thrush listens for the worm. Then, with the tips of 2 fingers, he lifted the edge of the tiara. The diamonds trembled once, very slightly, catching the chandelier light and scattering it across the dead woman's cheeks, like tears she had been too proud to shed in life. Poirot's eyes, green and bright as absinthe, narrowed. Around the girdle of the central stone, an exquisite pear-shaped diamond of 22 carats, he detected a hair-fine seam, invisible to any but the most discerning gaze. He gave a soft exclamation beneath his breath. Tiens, this is not merely a jewel, Inspector. This is an instrument. Larson blinked. A what? But Poirot was already kneeling, heedless of the crease in his trousers that had been pressed that morning in his suite at the hotel. He studied the Countess's hands. They lay folded upon her breast, the fingers slender, the nails lacquered the color of fresh blood. Yet the knuckles were faintly blue, the fingertips darker still. Rigor had begun, but not yet completed its grim work. The right hand was more contracted than the left, the thumb pressed hard against the palm, as though she had tried, in her final moment, to grasp something just out of reach. Poirot's gaze traveled downward. Beneath the heel of her silver evening slipper, crushed almost flat, lay a single white gardenia, its petals bruised and fragrant. He lifted it delicately, held it to his nose, then passed it to Larson. Notice, mon ami. The flower is fresh. It was not brought in with the snow on someone's coat. Someone placed it here, beneath her foot, after death. A signature, perhaps. Larson stared at the gardenia as though it might bite him. A signature. Or a mockery, Poirot murmured. He rose, smoothing invisible wrinkles from his coat. Tell me, Inspector, who among the living had reason to mock the Countess von Rosenkjaer in her death? Larson hesitated. She was not universally beloved. Old Junker family, enormous wealth, the last of her direct line. There is the husband, of course, 25 years older, paralyzed since a hunting accident 3 years ago. There is her companion, Freya Lindström, a distant cousin, utterly dependent. There is Captain Axel Thorvaldsen, once her fiancé, cast off when the Dyke Count offered marriage. There is an English art dealer named Blake, who has been negotiating to buy the tiara for months, and Larson lowered his voice. There is a Russian woman, Madame Olga Petrovna, who claims the tiara was looted from the Romanovs in 1918 and has sworn to reclaim it by any means. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Any means, précisément. And all of them, I presume, are still within the hotel. The blizzard, Larson said grimly. Every road out of Copenhagen is blocked. The trains have stopped. Even the ferries to Malmö cannot sail. We are all prisoners here until the weather breaks. A soft moan came from the adjoining room. Larson started. The Count. He has been sedated, but he keeps asking to see the body. Poirot inclined his head. Then let us not keep nobility waiting. They passed through the communicating door into a darker, more masculine chamber paneled in walnut. A log fire burned low in the grate. In a bath chair by the window sat Count Karl von Rosenkjaer, a rug over his knees, his silver hair disheveled, his patrician face collapsed into lines of grief, or something colder. His eyes, the same pale blue as his wife's had been, fixed on Poirot with startling intensity. You are the Belgian detective, he said in accented French. They say you are clever. Then tell me how any human hand could have placed my Ingrid in her coffin while I lay 10 feet away and heard not a sigh. Poirot bowed. Monsieur le Comte, I am desolated by your loss. Permit me, however, to observe that the coffin has not yet been ordered, and your wife lies not in beauty rather than repose. As for the silence, He paused, listening. From somewhere deep in the hotel came the faint, rhythmic creak of old wood settling under snow. This building is full of voices for those who know how to hear them. The Count's mouth twisted. You speak in riddles while my wife grows cold? Better riddles than mistakes, Poirot replied gently. Tell me, monsieur, when did you last see the Countess alive? Last evening, at 11. She came to bid me good night. She wore the tiara. She intended to display it at breakfast for that odious Englishman Blake. She kissed my forehead, laughed at some nothing, and returned to her room. I took my sleeping draught and knew no more until the maid's screams awoke me. And the door between your rooms? Locked, always locked. Ingrid was particular about her privacy. Poirot nodded, his gaze drifting to the fireplace. A small heap of ash lay in the hearth, the remains of papers burned hastily. He stooped, extracted a fragment with tweezers from his pocket. The corner of heavy cream notepaper, part of an embossed coronet visible. Particular indeed, he murmured. A sudden clamor arose in the corridor. Running feet, a woman's sharp cry. Larson strode to the door and flung it open. The young chambermaid, Astrid, stood there, white-faced, clutching her apron. The safe, she gasped. In Madame's dressing room, the jewel safe. It is open and empty. Every casket, every pearl, gone. Snow tapped insistently at the windows like 1,000 impatient fingers. Somewhere in the hotel, a clock struck 8. Poirot closed his eyes for a single heartbeat, and when he opened them again, they burned with the pure, cold light of the hunter who has scented his prey. Then, mademoiselle, he said softly to the trembling maid, we shall begin with absence, for it appears that while the Countess has gained a tiara that kills, she has lost every other jewel she possessed. And that, mes amis, is a contradiction which Hercule Poirot does not permit. He turned back toward the royal suite, his small figure suddenly the still center of the storm, and the snow continued to fall as though the very heavens wished to bury the truth before he could unearth it. Chapter 2. The Five Who Could Not Leave. By 10 o'clock, the blizzard had sealed Copenhagen as tightly as a letter in wax. The wind howled along the facades of Nyhavn like a wounded wolf, and every bridge, every railway line, every pier lay buried under drifts higher than a man's head. In the great salon of the Hôtel d'Angleterre, with its gilded paneling and disapproving portraits of long-dead Danish admirals, Hercule Poirot had ordered fires lit at both ends, and the tall windows shuttered against the white chaos outside. The 5 suspects sat beneath the chandeliers like reluctant players upon a stage, each in a pool of yellow light, each separated from the others by careful yards of Aubusson carpet, as though proximity itself might prove contagious. Poirot stood before the marble fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, the flames gilding the perfect curves of his moustache, and ego had waxed to military precision that morning. He regarded them one by one with the mild, unblinking stare of a cat who already knows which mouse will bolt first. Freya Lindström, the companion, sat very straight in a chair too large for her, twisting a handkerchief into damp knots. Her eyes red from weeping, yet curiously dry at the lashes. Captain Axel Thorvaldsen, still in evening dress from the night before, had loosened his collar and poured himself a third aquavit. The tremor in his hand made the glass chime softly against his teeth. Madame Olga Petrovna, swathed in black sable despite the heat of the room, smoked a Turkish cigarette through a long ebony holder, and watched Poirot with the unreadable calm of a woman who had already lost everything once and found the experience instructive. Mr. Reginald Blake, the English art dealer, kept polishing his monocle with unnecessary violence, as though clarity might yet be forced upon the situation by optical means. And finally, in his wheelchair by the window, Count Karl von Rosenkjaer, a plaid rug over his knees, stared into the fire with the fixity of a man listening to music only he could hear. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, his voice soft, yet carrying to the furthest corner. We are prisoners together. Yes, but prisoners of honor. Outside, the snow erases the world. Inside, the truth still walks. One of you arranged that the Countess should die beautifully, silently, impossibly, in a room locked from within. One of you has stolen every jewel she possessed, save the tiara that crowned her corpse. Hercule Poirot does not believe in miracles, only in motives. Therefore, I require of you perfect candor, for the storm will keep us here many days, and lies, like fish, begin to smell after 3. Freya gave a small, broken cry. I loved her. She was everything to me, mother, sister, goddess. Why would I harm her? Because, Poirot answered gently, you are 26 years old, mademoiselle, and for 8 years you have lived upon her charity. Because last month she confided to her intention to acknowledge you publicly as her half-sister and alter her will accordingly. Because the Count, your uncle by marriage, would then receive nothing but debts and a castle falling into ruin. Is that not so, monsieur? The Count's pale eyes flickered, but he said nothing. Captain Thorvaldsen slammed his glass down. If you want motives, look to the jewels. Ingrid promised me the tiara as settlement when she threw me over for that. He jerked his head toward the wheelchair. That relic, she reneged. I was ruined. Everyone knows it. Everyone knows also, Poirot murmured, that you were ruined long before the Countess cast you off, Captain. Cards, horses, and a certain dancer at the Apollo Theatre, n'est-ce pas? Axel flushed crimson. Madame Olga exhaled a perfect ring of smoke. The tiara is Romanov property, she said, in a voice like frost on glass. Stolen by a Danish officer in 1918, sold to finance White Russian treason. It bears a cipher in its settings that would guide the rightful heirs to a fortune hidden in Paris. I came only to reclaim what is mine. I did not kill for it. Yet you threatened to, madame, in letters to the Countess still exist. She shrugged, a movement eloquent of centuries of aristocratic indifference. Blake cleared his throat. I offered 2 million kroner for the piece, sight unseen, on behalf of an American collector. The Countess was on the point of accepting. Her death voids the contract. I lose my commission. Hardly a reason for murder. Unless, Poirot said silkily, the American collector does not exist, and you intended to disappear with the tiara yourself the moment the sale was complete. Blake's monocle fell with a tinkling clatter. Poirot turned last to the Count. And you, monsieur, married a woman young enough to be your daughter, rich enough to restore your estates, beautiful enough to adorn your declining years. Yet for 3 years, you have sat imprisoned in that chair while she danced, flirted, spent. Did the temptation to free yourself become at last irresistible? The Count lifted his head. For a moment, the mask slipped, and Poirot saw raw hatred glittering in those ice-blue eyes. Then the mask was back in place. I am a von Rosenkjaer, he said quietly. We do not murder our wives. We endure them. Silence fell, broken only by the wind rattling the windows like a desperate visitor. Poirot, allowed it to stretch until nerves frayed, then spoke again. Very well. We understand one another. You will all remain within the hotel. You will surrender your passports to Inspector Larson, and you will wear, every one of you, a white gardenia in buttonhole or corsage, for the flower crushed beneath the Countess's heel interests me greatly. They stared at him as though he had gone mad. At midnight, when the hotel had settled into uneasy sleep, a single gunshot cracked through the corridors like a whip. Doors flew open, guests in dressing gowns stumbled out. Larson bellowed for order. The sound had come from the direction of the royal suite. Poirot, already fully dressed, he had not slept, arrived first, Larson panting behind him. The door remained bolted from within. No reply came to their knocks. With the night porter's passkey, they opened the communicating door from the Count's side and stepped into the dead woman's bedroom. Moonlight, thin and cold, lay across the carpet. The tiara rested in the exact center of the floor, thrown or placed there, its diamonds glittering like frost. One stone, the great pear-shaped center, was missing. On the mirror above the dressing table, scrawled in the Countess's own crimson lipstick, were the words, "The trembling hands. Take back what is theirs." A draught stirred the curtains, though the windows were sealed. Somewhere in the walls, wood creaked like footsteps retreating. Poirot stood motionless, the little grey cells racing, while behind him 5 white-faced suspects gathered in the doorway, and the snow went on falling as though it would never stop, until every secret was buried forever. Chapter 3. The Gardenia Ghost. The gunshot still echoed in their ears when Poirot knelt beside the tiara, gloved fingers hovering like a pianist above silent keys, afraid to touch the wrong note. Moonlight poured through the unsealed slit between the shutters and turned the scattered diamonds into a small frozen galaxy. Yet the empty claw, where the 22-carat center stone had sat, gaped like a socket from which an eye had been torn. The crimson words on the mirror seemed to pulse, darker than blood, wetter than lipstick should be after 5 hours. Poirot leaned closer, sniffed once, and his moustache quivered with distaste. "Fresh," he murmured. "Written within the last quarter hour. Our ghost, it appears, is punctual." Inspector Larson, face blanched to the color of tallow, crossed himself involuntarily. "The old legend," he whispered. "Johann Falk, the jeweler who crafted the tiara in 1788. When the French Revolution came, his Parisian patrons vanished. He was ruined, arrested, guillotined. They say his hands, severed, yet still twitching, were buried with the tiara, because he had hidden a fortune inside it. On nights of snowfall, the hands return, searching." His voice cracked. "Forgive me, Herr Poirot, but every servant in the hotel is refusing to enter this wing." Poirot rose briskly. "Then we shall manage without them. Observe, Inspector, the carpet is thick, yet around the tiara there are no footprints except our own. The door remains bolted on the inside, the windows sealed, the chimney far too narrow even for a child. Therefore, the writer of those words was already in the suite when we broke in, or possesses wings." He turned to the 5 suspects, clustered in the doorway like sheep before wolves. "Which of you, then, is the ghost?" Freya Lindstrom swayed and would have fallen had Axel Thorvaldsen not caught her. She clutched at his sleeve with desperate strength, but her eyes were fixed upon the mirror as though the letters burned there. "She is walking," Freya whispered. "Ingrid is walking again. She always said she would never leave the tiara to anyone." "Silence, girl," The Count snapped from his chair, voice cracking like old ice. Yet Poirot noticed that the old man's knuckles were white upon the plaid rug, and his gaze kept sliding towards the empty claw in the tiara, as though expecting the missing stone to materialize by will alone. Madame Olga Petrovna laughed once, low and bitter. Superstition for peasants. The stone was removed by human hands. My hands, if you wish to know the truth. I took it at 11:30, before the poison had finished its work. I intended to extract the cipher and return the diamond later. But when I opened the setting, she opened her gloved palm. Upon it lay the great pear-shaped stone, yet its heart was dark, clouded, ruined. Someone had replaced the original with glass and hidden the true stone elsewhere. I came back tonight to search again. That is when the gun was fired, to frighten me away, no doubt. Larson lunged forward. You admit theft in a murder room. I admit desperation, she replied coldly. Not murder. Poirot took the false stone between thumb and forefinger, held it to the moonlight. Glass, yes, but of remarkable quality. The substitution must have been made by a master. And the original, where is it now? His gaze swept the room and settled upon Captain Thorwaldsen's evening pumps, still flecked with melted snow from his earlier wanderings. Captain, you have something in your shoe, I think. Axel stared down stupidly. The left bump had ridden up slightly on his heel. Something glittered inside the leather. With a curse, he pulled the shoe off, and the true 22-carat diamond rolled across the carpet like a fallen star. I found it loose on the dressing table at 2:00, he stammered. The Countess was already. I panicked. I thought only to secure it until morning. Until morning, Poirot echoed softly. When you would sell it, to pay the debts that threatened to send you to prison. You entered a room containing a corpse, and your first instinct was larceny. How very instructive. Axel's face worked. Sweat shone on his forehead, though the room was cold. I swear I did not kill her. When I came in, she was lying just as you found her, tiara on her head, hands folded, smiling that damned smile. Freya gave a sudden, daring sob and fled down the corridor. The others stood frozen. Only the Count moved, wheeling his chair forward until the blanket brushed the tiara. For an instant, his reflection in the mirror overlaid the crimson words, and Poirot saw something raw and exultant flash across the old man's eyes before the mask returned. Poirot bent and retrieved the true diamond. It was warm, unnaturally warm. He pressed it against his cheek and felt a faint pulse of retained body heat. Curious, he said aloud. The stone has rested against living skin within the hour, yet the Countess has been dead since 11:45. He looked up, and his gaze pinned each of them in turn. Someone in this hotel wore the heart of the tiara against their flesh tonight, knowing it had killed once and might kill again. Someone wished us to believe in ghosts. But Hercule Poirot believes only in murderers who are running out of time. From the depths of the hotel came the slow, deliberate chime of the grandfather clock in the lobby. 1, 2, 3. The storm redoubled its assault upon the windows, and in the draught, the crimson words on the mirror seemed to writhe like living things. Poirot slipped both diamonds, true and false, into his waistcoat pocket, patted them once, and smiled a small, dangerous smile. Sleep if you can, mes amis. Tomorrow the little grey cells will require breakfast and answers. He turned toward the door. Behind him, the empty tiara lay on the carpet, like a crown waiting for the next head foolish enough to claim it, while overhead the chandelier trembled, though no wind touched it, and the diamonds that remained cast 36 perfect shadows upon the ceiling, shadows that looked, to those who dared stare too long, disturbingly, like clutching hands. Chapter 4. The Captain's Confession. Dawn came late and sullen, a pewter light that seeped through the shutters and turned every face the color of old ash. Captain Axel Thorvaldsen had not slept. He sat alone in the smaller smoking room, staring at the empty aquavit bottle as though it might refill itself by remorse. When Poirot entered at 7:30, silent upon the thick carpet, Axel flinched so violently that the bottle toppled and rolled in slow circles across the parquet. Poirot righted it with one precise finger, then settled himself opposite the captain like a doctor preparing to lance an abscess. "You are unwell, mon capitaine," Poirot observed kindly. "Guilt is a poison slower than cyanide, yet just as certain." Axel's laugh cracked in the middle. "You have me, Monsieur Poirot. I stole the diamond. I crept into her room at 2 in the morning with a duplicate key I had made months ago, when I still believed she might come back to me. I found her exactly as you saw her, tiara on her head, gardenia under her heel, smiling at death as she never smiled at me. The center stone was already loose. It fell into my hand like a gift. I took it. God help me. I took it and ran." His voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. "But I did not kill her. On my honor, as an officer, I did not kill her." Poirot studied the man for a long moment, head tilted, eyes bright and merciless. "Honor," he repeated softly. "A commodity you have pawned many times, I think. Yet in this, perhaps, you speak truth. Tell me everything, every creak of the corridor, every scent, every shadow." Axel closed his eyes. The corridor smelled of gardenias, her perfume always too strong. The door opened without a sound. Moonlight lay across the bed, but she was not in it. She was on the chaise longue, arranged like a shop window mannequin. The tiara caught the light and threw it back in my eyes. I thought at first she was asleep, posing for some cruel joke. Then I saw the blueness at her lips. I touched her cheek, cold already. The center stone shifted under my thumb. It was warm, Monsieur Poirot. Warm as flesh. Warm, though she was dead. That is when I fled. Poirot leaned forward. Warm, you say, yet the room was cold, and the gardenia beneath her heel. Was it already crushed when you arrived? Axel nodded miserably, flattened as though she had crowned it there herself in her final agony. But she had not moved. Her body was perfect, undisturbed. Poirot sat back, fingers drumming a silent tattoo upon the arm of his chair. "Parfait. Now we progress. You are a thief, Captain, but perhaps not a murderer. Yet someone wishes us to believe you are both." He rose. "Come, we shall test the sincerity of your confession." He led Axel to the royal suite, now guarded by a shivering constable. The tiara had been returned to its velvet case, the mirror cleaned, the body removed to the hotel's cold larder, pending the coroner's sled. Poirot opened the case, lifted the tiara, and with delicate precision pressed the empty central claw. A faint click sounded. The claw sprang open, revealing a hollow cavity lined with tarnished silver and the faintest residue of white crystals. Axel stared, transfixed. "Mon Dieu," he breathed. "A poison ring hidden in plain sight for 150 years." "Not a ring," Poirot corrected. "A reservoir. The mechanism is exquisite. Body heat, the warmth of the brow against the metal, melts a wafer-thin seal of wax. Cyanide gas is released through 36 microscopic perforations around the setting. Death in 90 seconds, silent, odorless, once the initial trace has dispersed. The perfect murder weapon for one who would kill with a kiss. Axel's face had gone the color of wet paper. Then, anyone who placed the tiara upon her head. Exactly. And last night, someone removed the stone to prevent me discovering the mechanism too soon. But they were interrupted by your gunshot, Captain. No, do not deny it. The pistol is in your room beneath the mattress. One round fired into the ceiling to create panic while the thief escaped. You are a poor criminal, mon ami, but an excellent smokescreen. Axel sank into a chair, head in hands. What happens to me now? Now, Poirot said cheerfully, you will drink the excellent coffee I have ordered, and you will remain under guard until I decide whether you are fool or accomplice. Meanwhile, I set a little trap. That evening, after a silent dinner, during which no one met anyone else's eyes, Poirot caused a tray to be carried to the salon. A single bottle of 1865 cognac, 3 glasses, and a small silver bowl of sugar lumps. He poured generously, dropped a lump into each glass, and invited the company to join him in a toast to the Countess's memory. Freya refused, pleading headache. The Count took his glass in trembling fingers. Madame Olga declined, with a regal inclination of the head. Blake drank nervously. Axel, still pale from his confession, swallowed his in one gulp. Poirot raised his own glass, inhaled the bouquet, and set it down untasted. Santé, he murmured, and watched. 10 minutes later, the young chambermaid Astrid entered with fresh logs for the fire. She had scarcely crossed the threshold when her eyes rolled back, her knees buckled, and she collapsed in a heap, limbs twitching, a thin froth at her lips. Larson shouted for the doctor. Poirot knelt, sniffed the girl's breath, and gave a soft exclamation of satisfaction. Harmless, he announced, producing a small vial from his pocket. A mild derivative of scopolamine, enough to cause collapse and brief convulsions, no more. The real dose was in the sugar lumps. Someone in this room intended that Captain Thorvaldsen should not live to repeat his confession tomorrow. He turned to the 5 faces, each registering its own shade of horror or calculation. You see, mes amis, the murderer grows nervous, and nervous murderers make mistakes. Tonight, someone made a very large one. From the corridor came the sound of running feet, the doctor summoned by telephone. Poirot allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The trap had been baited with cognac and fear, and someone had bitten. The little grey cells hummed like bees in springtime. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and in the sudden silence, the hotel seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next scream. Chapter 5. The sleeping maid, Astrid, came back to the world with a gasp that sounded like drowning reversed, her body arching off the sofa, as though an invisible hand had yanked her from deep water. For a moment, she stared at the ring of faces above her, with the blank terror of a child waking from nightmare. Then memory flooded in, and she began to scream, thin, high, unstoppable screams that scraped along everyone's nerves. Poirot let her scream until the sound shredded itself into sobs. Then he laid 2 fingers lightly against her pulse, murmured, "Chut, petite, chut," and pressed a small glass of water to her lips. She drank obediently, coughed, drank again, and finally, the storm subsided into hiccuping breaths. "Better," Poirot said softly. "Now you will tell Hercule Poirot exactly what you saw, and why someone wished you silent." Astrid's gaze darted to Madame Olga, then away. "I saw nothing, monsieur. Only dreams." Dreams that smell of bitter almonds and gardenia, Poirot replied. Dreams that leave bruises on the arm where someone pinched you unconscious at 11 o'clock last night. Come, child. The sugar in the cognac was meant for another, but the drug in your veins tonight was meant for you alone. Speak, or the next dose will not be so gentle. The girl began to cry again, but this time the words stumbled out between sobs. It was Madame Olga. 3 days ago in the linen room, she gave me 50 kroner and a little bottle. She said it was only perfume essence, concentrated, to be added to the Countess's gardenia water. To help Madame sleep deeply before the journey to Paris, she said. No harm, only rest. I swear I thought it harmless. I poured it into the crystal flacon on the dressing table yesterday afternoon while Madame napped. That is all, monsieur. I swear by the Virgin. Madame Olga's cigarette snapped between her fingers. Idiot child, she hissed. You have killed her yourself. No, Poirot interrupted calmly. You supplied the vial, madame, but someone else turned perfume into murder. The gardenia scent masked the first faint trace of cyanide. The rest evaporated. Very clever, but not clever enough. He turned back to Astrid. And tonight? Who came to your room with warm milk and kind words? Astrid's voice dropped to a whisper. Freya. Miss Lindstrom. She said I looked ill, that the shock. She made me drink it at the door. Then everything spun and went black. Freya, standing near the fireplace, went rigid. I was trying to calm her. She was hysterical all day. Calm her into a coma, Poirot observed. Fortunately, Larson had the foresight to test the cognac tray before it left the pantry. I substituted harmless tablets for whatever poison had been added to the sugar. But the milk you gave Astrid contained the real dose, enough chloral to keep her silent for days, perhaps forever. You begin to panic, mademoiselle. Freya's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The Count watched her with the detached curiosity of a man observing an insect pinned to cork. Larson stepped forward, handcuffs ready, but Poirot lifted one finger. Patience, Inspector. We have an accessory, not yet the assassin. He turned to the company. Meanwhile, a telegram has fought its way through the storm on the emergency wire. The toxicologist confirms potassium cyanide. Death between 11:15 and 11:45. Excellent. We may now eliminate and illuminate. He moved to the center of the room and, with the air of a conjurer revealing the final card, produced a sheet of hotel notepaper covered in neat columns. Behold the alibis for the fatal half hour. 5 alibis, Poirot said, letting the paper flutter to the carpet. 5 witnesses, and every one impeccable. Therefore, mi ami, everyone false. A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. Outside, the wind had dropped entirely. The silence felt suddenly enormous. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Consider, a hotel half empty because of the storm, corridors deserted, servants huddled in the basement, exchanging ghost stories. Who, then, truly saw what they claim? The English couple from Aarhus drank aquavit steadily and argued about their son's engagement. They would swear the King of Denmark played bridge with them if asked politely. The barman was polishing glasses and dreaming of his sweetheart in Odense. He noticed only that the captain kept drinking. The chambermaid on the second floor is terrified of Madame Olga and would say whatever Madame told her to say. The nurse? He paused, turned to the Count. The nurse, monsieur, has a mother dying in Jutland. You have promised to pay for the funeral if she is cooperative. Is that not so? The Count's face remained marble. but a vein beat visibly at his temple. Poirot continued. And Miss Lindstrom and Mr. Blake were indeed playing cards, but the smoking room clock has been wrong by exactly 32 minutes since the chambermaid overwound it last week. They finished their rubber at what they believed was 11:10. In reality, it was 11:42. 3 minutes later, the Countess was dead. Blake made a strangled sound. Freya pressed both hands to her mouth. So, Poirot concluded, almost gently, we have no alibis at all. Only a conspiracy of convenience. And one of you, or more than one, moved through these corridors like smoke, placed the fatal tiara upon a sleeping woman's head, and returned to their place as though nothing had happened. But smoke leaves a scent, and Hercule Poirot has a most sensitive nose. He bowed slightly, the gesture of a man who has just drawn the first blood. In the fireplace, a log shifted and fell, sending up a shower of sparks that died before they touched the hearth. Astrid, forgotten on the sofa, began to cry again, quietly now, like spring rain. Somewhere in the walls, the old building settled with a groan, and for a moment, it sounded exactly like a woman sighing. Poirot listened, head cocked, then nodded once. Yes, he said to the empty air. We are getting closer. The house itself begins to speak. And in the hush that followed, every person present felt the same cold certainty settle upon their hearts. Before the snow melted, one of them would hang, and the Hotel d'Angleterre would never forget the winter the tiara killed its wearer. Chapter 6. The Alibi of Ice. At 2:30 in the morning, the hotel lights failed. One moment, the chandeliers blazed like captive suns. The next, darkness swallowed everything, sudden and complete. As though a giant hand had pinched out every flame. A woman screamed somewhere on the second floor, glass shattered. A man swore in sonorous Danish. Then came the hurried scrape of matches, the thin yellow bloom of candle flames, and the slow return of faces made grotesque by shadow. Poirot, who had been waiting for exactly this moment, slipped from the salon before anyone thought to count heads. He moved through the black corridors like a small black cat, candle stub held low, patent leather shoes silent on the runner. On the top landing, he paused, listening. Far below, Larson was bellowing for calm. Above, the attic door stood ajar, a rectangle of deeper darkness, exhaling freezing air. Poirot climbed the narrow service stairs, pushed open the door, and stepped out onto the roof. The storm had spent itself. The sky was a bowl of polished steel, pricked with stars, the snow lying in smooth virginal waves across the leads. Copenhagen slept beneath a white shroud, the spires of Vorfrue Kirke and the round tower of Rundeton, mere suggestions of black against black. Poirot's breath plumed silver as he crossed to the parapet above the royal suite. There, half buried in a drift, lay a perfect line of footprints, small, neat, made by a woman's evening slipper, leading from the chimney stack to the edge and back again. At the edge, the snow was scooped away in a neat semicircle, as though someone had knelt there, looking down into the lighted suite 3 floors below. Poirot knelt in the same place. From here, through the gap between shutters, he had noticed earlier, but dismissed as a servant's oversight. The chaise longue was perfectly visible. One could have watched the Countess compose herself for sleep, watched her place the tiara upon her brow like a crown of ice, watched the faint tremor of diamonds become the final tremor of a dying woman. Poirot brushed snow from his gloves and followed the prince to the chimney. A thin silk rope, almost invisible against the snow, was knotted around the stack and dropped inside the flue. He tested it, strong enough for a slight person or for a parcel no heavier than a jewel case. The footprints ended at the attic door. Inside, a second set, larger, a man's boots this time, led down the back stairs toward the servants' quarters. Poirot smiled in the dark. The house had spoken again, and this time it had left footprints in the snow. He returned to the salon to find panic barely contained. Candles guttered on every table. Faces floated like pale and disembodied above the flames. Larson had stationed constables at both staircases. The Count's wheelchair was drawn close to the fire. His eyes reflected the flames like chips of burning ice. Freya clutched a candlestick as though it were a weapon. Madame Olga sat apart, smoking ceaselessly, the smoke curling upward until it vanished into darkness. Blake kept polishing and repolishing his useless monocle. Only Axel was missing. He went to fetch more candles, Freya whispered. 10 minutes ago. Poirot's eyebrows ascended. 10 minutes is long enough to hang a man, mademoiselle. He took one of the candles and walked alone into the corridor. Halfway along the grand staircase, he found what he expected. A fallen candlestick, wax pooled like white blood, and a smear of fresh red on the marble balustrade. He touched it, still wet. Then, 3 steps below, a single white gardenia, its petals bruised and bleeding sap. He picked it up, inhaled once, and began to climb again, slowly, letting the candle throw his shadow gigantic against the walls. On the first floor landing, the struggle had been brief and brutal. Axel lay on his back, arms flung wide, evening shirt torn open at the throat. A thin silk cord, the same that had hung down the chimney, was knotted twice around his neck. His face was purple, tongue protruding, eyes starting from their sockets. Yet even in death, his right hand clutched something tightly. The missing center diamond, now dark with congealed blood, where it had cut into his palm. Poirot knelt, gently pried the stone free, and saw that the hollow reservoir inside was empty, the microscopic perforations clogged with frozen blood. Behind him, Larson arrived panting, lantern swinging. "Murder," he cried. "Now we have 2. "No," Poirot corrected quietly. "We have the same murder, only the murderer grows careless." The captain was silenced because he knew whose footprints crossed the roof, and because he carried this. He held up the diamond. In the lantern light, the blood looked black. "The heart of the tiara, removed after death so that I should not discover the mechanism too soon. Returned tonight to mislead us. But the murderer did not expect Axel to wake and fight." He rose and looked upward, into the darkness that pressed down like a lid. "Bring everyone to the salon again, Inspector. This time, Hercule Poirot will not ask questions. He will give answers." Half an hour later, they were assembled once more, candles arranged in a circle so that no face could hide. Snowlight filtered through the tall windows, turning the room spectral. Poirot stood in the center, the blood-stained diamond in one hand, the silk rope coiled in the other, like a dead snake. "The alibis of ice have melted," he began, voice soft yet carrying to the furthest corner. "The roof has spoken. A woman climbed down the chimney, entered, the suite through the shutter, left deliberately unfastened, placed the tiara upon the sleeping countess's head, waited 90 seconds, perhaps less, removed the center stone to conceal the method, and climbed back the way she came. A man followed later to retrieve the stone and close the shutter, but the storm covered his tracks too well. He left the rope. Tonight they tried again, this time to plant the diamond on the captain and silence him forever. But they reckoned without the little grey cells." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it vibrated. Freya Lindstrom, he said suddenly. You wear French evening slippers with Louis heels, size 36. The prints on the roof are size 36. You also climb like the chamois. Your childhood was spent on your father's estate in the mountains. Freya made a small choked sound. Count von Rosenkjaer, Poirot continued, turning. You are not paralyzed. You proved that when you tried to push me down the main staircase 20 minutes ago in the dark. Your legs are strong, your hands stronger. You followed Freya tonight to retrieve the stone. But Axel surprised you both. The Count's face remained impassive, but the pulse beat visibly in his throat. Together, Poirot said, almost sadly, half-sister and husband, you killed the woman who stood between you and 20 million kroner. You discovered the tiara's secret mechanism in Paris last winter when the stone was cleaned. You waited for the perfect, locked room. You used the storm. You used superstition. You almost succeeded. Freya began to laugh then, high, breaking laughter that held no mirth. The Count's hand moved beneath the rug. Larsen lunged, but too late. A small mother-of-pearl revolver glinted. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Freya screamed once. The Count put the barrel to his own temple and fired again. He slumped sideways, blood spreading across the plaid like spilled claret. Freya fell to her knees beside the chair, keening. The candle flames bowed all at once, as though a door had opened somewhere, and the smell of gardenias was suddenly, overpoweringly strong. Poirot stood motionless among the ruin of his triumph, the bloody diamond still in his hand, watching the snowlight die in the Count's eyes. Outside, the first pale blade of true dawn cut across the sky, and the snow began to melt from the eaves in slow, heavy drops that sounded, in the terrible silence, exactly like tears. Chapter 7. The Hand That Trembled. The shot still rang in the rafters when Poirot moved, faster than anyone expected of so small and dapper a man, and plucked the revolver from the Count's slack fingers before Larsen could reach it. The old nobleman's head had fallen sideways against the wing of the chair. A neat black hole sat just above his right ear, and the wall behind was spattered with a pattern, delicate as pointillism. Freya Lindstrom knelt in the widening pool of blood, her pale dress drinking it in like blotting paper. Yet she did not seem to notice. She rocked back and forth, crooning a Danish lullaby under her breath, while tears cut clean channels through the powder on her cheeks. The smell of gunpowder and gardenias mingled until the air felt too thick to breathe. Larsen's constables stood frozen, uselessly at the doors. Blake retched quietly into his handkerchief. Madame Olga crossed herself with the mechanical precision of long habit. Only Poirot remained perfectly composed. He wrapped the revolver in his pocket handkerchief, laid it on a side table, and addressed the room in the same gentle tone he might have used to recommend a wine. Mesdames et messieurs, the play is not yet finished. One actor has left the stage by his own hand, but the script was written earlier, and certain pages remain to be read aloud. He turned to Freya, lifted her chin with two gloved fingers until her streaming eyes met his. Mademoiselle, your grief is admirable, but it arrives several hours too late. The Count was never paralyzed. The nurse has already confessed, under the promise of train fare to her dying mother, that for 3 years she injected plain water, while he paid her handsomely to swear it was morphia. He walked when no one watched. He climbed the back stairs tonight to silence Captain Thorvaldsen. and he placed the tiara upon his wife's head last night, while you, ma petite, kept watch from the roof. Freya tried to pull away. Poirot's grip, deceptively delicate, held her as firmly as steel. You discovered the mechanism together in Paris, he continued. A jeweler there, seeking to clean the center stone, showed you the hollow reservoir, an 18th century curiosity forgotten by time. You saw destiny. The Countess intended to acknowledge you publicly next month. Yes, but only after securing your future. But for the Count, that meant disgrace, penury, the sale of the estates. For you, it meant sharing what you believed should be yours alone. Blood, after all, is thinner than greed. She spat at him then, a sudden wildcat motion. The spittle struck his cheek. He removed it with a silk handkerchief, as though it were no more than a speck of snow. Larson stepped forward, handcuffs ready, but Poirot raised one finger again. A moment, Inspector. There is a detail that still trembles. He released Freya, turned to the tiara lying innocently on its velvet cushion beneath the candelabrum. With infinite care, he lifted it, turned it so the empty central claw faced the company, then pressed a concealed spring at the back of the setting. A soft sigh, almost human, escaped the metal. 36 hair-fine jets exhaled a faint white mist that vanished instantly into the candle-warmed air. Even now, Poirot said quietly, a single crystal remains, enough for one more death. The Count intended it for me, I think, when my questions became too precise. Fortunately, he chose the dramatic exit. Instead, he laid the tiara down again and faced Madame Olga. And you, Madame, or should I say Katya Alexeyevna Romanova, you supplied the final touch. 6 months ago in Paris, you replaced the true center stone with a hollow duplicate filled with cyanide, planning to reclaim the tiara later and expose the forgery. You believed the original stone contained the key to a Romanov cipher. But the Count discovered your substitution, removed your poisoned stone, and installed his own, more lethal charge. You became the unwitting armorer of your enemy. Olga's face beneath the black veil was marble. I wished only to recover what was stolen from my family. By murder. By any means, she repeated, the same words she had used days earlier. Only now they sounded like a confession. Poirot sighed. 3 hands trembled around that tiara. The maker's in 1788, Katya's in vengeance, and the Count's in avarice. The Countess never knew she crowned herself with death. He turned last to the body in the wheelchair. Blood had ceased to flow. The Count's face, in death, looked almost peaceful. The lines of bitterness smoothed away. Poirot reached forward and with gentle reverence closed the staring eyes. Pauvre homme, he murmured. You endured your wife, as you said, until endurance became hatred. Then you arranged that she should endure you forever, in memory, in scandal, in the ruin of your name. A poor bargain. Freya's lullaby had dissolved into broken sobs. Larson at last moved, hauling her to her feet. The handcuffs clicked like punctuation marks at the end of a very long sentence. She did not resist. As the constables led her away, her slipper left small red prints across the pale carpet, a trail that ended at the door, where moonlight now poured in unchecked, turning the blood black. Madame Olga rose unaided. I will come quietly, she said in a voice suddenly old. There is nothing left to steal. Within minutes, the salon was empty, save for Poirot and the dead man. He stood a long time in silence, the blood-stained diamond resting in his palm like a dark fruit. Finally, he slipped it into his waistcoat pocket beside its hollow twin, patted them once, and addressed the corpse conversationally. You forgot, mon vieux, that paralysis leaves the calf muscles wasted. When you pushed me on the stairs in the dark, your legs were too strong, too quick. A small thing, but Hercule Poirot notices small things. He turned toward the windows. Outside, the sky had cleared to a cold, radiant blue. The snow on the roofs glittered with a million cruel facets. From the street below came the jingle of sleigh bells, the coroner's sled at last arriving now that the roads were passable. Poirot watched the first pale sunlight strike the tiara on its table. The remaining diamonds no longer trembled. The mechanism was spent, the poison gone, the hands stilled forever. He bowed once, very slightly, to the dead count. Adieu, monsieur. You chose the quicker justice than the courts would have granted. May God have mercy on a soul that showed so little to others. Then he walked out, closing the double doors softly behind him, leaving the tiara alone with its final wearer. Two silent figures bathed in merciless morning light, while far below in the melting snow, the first red roses of spring already pushed through the white, as though even Copenhagen refused to keep its secrets buried forever. Chapter 8. The Woman Who Never Was. The hotel woke to a changed light, thin, hard, and merciless, the kind of northern sun that exposes every flaw. In the grand salon, the blood had dried to a dull brown map across the parquet. A constable stood guard over the count's body, while another wrapped the tiara in cotton wool, as though it were still capable of biting. Poirot, immaculate in charcoal grey, entered at 9 o'clock, carrying a small leather folder and the expression of a man who has spent the night rearranging inconvenient truths into perfect order. Larson met him at the door, eyes red from lack of sleep and too much aquavit. It is finished, ja? The inspector asked hopefully. The Count killed his wife. The girl helped. He killed the captain to keep him quiet. Then he killed himself. Case closed. Poirot gave him the small, pitying smile he usually reserved for Hastings. Closed, mon ami. No. Merely the interval between acts. Bring Madame Olga to the writing room, alone. They placed her beneath the tall window that looked across Kongens Nytorv. The sun struck full upon her face and stripped away 10 years of careful artifice. Without the veil and the sable, she looked suddenly younger, almost fragile, the bones too fine, the mouth uncertain. Poirot laid the leather folder on the table between them and opened it with deliberate care. Inside lay a single photograph and a yellowed passport in the name of Olga Petrovna Golitsina, deceased 1931, Petrograd. Permit me to introduce you properly, Poirot said gently. You are Katia Alexeyevna Romanova, born 1902 in Tsarskoye Selo, daughter of Grand Duke Alexei Nikolaevich, who was not, as history believes, executed in Ekaterinburg with the rest of his family. You escaped through Finland with your nurse, lived in Paris under the protection of the Dowager Empress's circle, and have spent 15 years chasing ghosts and jewels. The real Madame Olga died of tuberculosis in a charity ward. You took her papers because she resembled you, and because her claim to the tiara was marginally stronger than your own. You are, in short, the woman who never was. Katia Romanova, living on forged hope. She stared at the photograph, a younger self in white Russian uniform, standing beside a man in a naval greatcoat, and something inside her seemed to fold. When she spoke, her voice was smaller, the accent no longer theatrical. I needed the cipher hidden in the tiara's setting. My uncle hid the last. Romanov Reserve in Switzerland. The key was engraved inside the great bear stone. I meant no murder, only substitution. I paid a Parisian jeweler to make the duplicate reservoir. He thought it a clever hiding place for diamonds, nothing more. I filled it with harmless powder so the weight would match. Someone else emptied it and filled it with death. Poirot nodded. That someone was the Count. He discovered your forgery when the tiara was sent to Copenhagen for cleaning last autumn. He saw opportunity, a perfect ancient murder weapon delivered into his hand by a Romanoff who wished him only embarrassment. He replaced your powder with cyanide, waited for the blizzard that would trap everyone together, and chose the night his wife planned to wear the tiara for Mr. Blake's inspection. Katya's eyes filled, but the tears did not fall. Then I armed him. You armed him, Poirot agreed, but you did not pull the trigger. That distinction matters in the eyes of God, if not of Danish law. He closed the folder. You will be deported, not tried. Your Romanov blood is passport enough. Copenhagen prefers quiet scandals. But before you leave, tell me one thing. The Countess knew your true identity. She gave a small, bitter laugh. Ingrid knew everything. She laughed at me. Said the days of princesses were finished and that diamonds belonged to whoever could keep them. She wore the tiara that last night to mock me. Poirot considered this, head tilted. Mockery is a sharp spice. Sometimes it turns the stomach of the cook. He rose. Au revoir, Votre Altesse. The world is smaller than it was in 1917, but perhaps large enough for one more ghost. When she had been led away, he stood a long time at the window, watching the sleighs glide across the square like black swans on white water. Then he returned to the salon where Larsen waited with fresh horror. The Count's nurse had been found at dawn in the snow beneath the kitchen window, throat cut with her own embroidery scissors, a white gardenia pinned to her blood-soaked apron. In her pocket, a note in the Count's spidery hand. I release you from your promise. The money is beneath the chapel altar. Forgive me. Larsen's face was green. He killed her too? From his wheelchair. He walked to her room after silencing Axel, Poirot said wearily. Persuaded her to write a confession absolving him, then staged a suicide. But the scissors were held in the left hand. The woman was right-handed. A small thing, but murderers who stage suicides often forget which hand holds the blade. He looked at the sheeted figure of the Count Karl, now awaiting the undertaker. He wished to die the last von Rosenkehr, master of his fate. Instead, he dies a common butcher who murdered a penniless nurse for silence. There is no dignity in that. Larsen cleared his throat. And the girl? Freya. Freya truly believed the Count loved her as a daughter. When she understood, tonight, that he had used her only as ladder to the roof and scapegoat for the rope, something broke. She will hang, or spend her life in a woman's prison, dreaming of an inheritance that now goes to pay funeral expenses. The estates are bankrupt. The tiara reverts to the Danish crown as unclaimed contraband. Everyone loses. That, Inspector, is what happens when greed wears the mask of family love. A constable entered, saluted awkwardly. Telephone call from the palace, Herr Poirot. His Majesty King Christian requests the honor of your company at Amalienborg this afternoon. Something about returning a certain piece of jewelry. Poirot's moustache twitched with reluctant amusement. Tell His Majesty I shall be delighted, provided the tiara travels in a very strong box and is never worn again. He glanced once more around the salon. Blood, melted wax, scattered gardenia petals wilting on the carpet, and felt the old familiar melancholy settle upon him. Another perfect crime imperfectly executed. Another house full of elegant monsters devouring one another for glittering baubles. He buttoned his overcoat, pulled on his galoshes, and stepped out into the blinding morning. The snow was already turning to slush in the streets. Children laughed as they pelted one another with the last snowballs of the season. Somewhere, a church bell began to ring for noon. Poirot paused on the hotel steps, breathed in the cold, clean air, and addressed the empty square in a soft voice. Enough of trembling hands. It is time for breakfast. And with that, the little Belgian walked off toward Tivoli, coattails flapping like satisfied raven wings, leaving the Hotel d'Angleterre to its ghosts and the Tiara of Trembling Hands to a glass case where it could kill no more queens, real or pretended. Chapter 9. The Inheritance of Ice. The palace sent a closed motor car at 3 o'clock, its black lacquer still flecked with road slush, like dried blood. Poirot sat alone in the back, gloved hands folded over the leather case that now contained the tiara, the two center stones, one true, one false, and a single white gardenia pressed flat between sheets of blotting paper. The king had asked only that the piece be delivered personally. He had not asked for explanations, which was fortunate, because Poirot had decided that some truths were better locked away with the jewels they had murdered for. Amalienborg was quiet, the sentries stiff as tin soldiers in the pale sun. A chamberlain, with the face of a disappointed Héron, led Poirot through corridors lined with portraits of earlier kings who had worn happier crowns. In a small, warm room panelled in pale green silk, Christian X waited beside an unlit fire, still in morning dress, the ribbon of the elephant across his breast. He greeted Poirot with the grave courtesy of a man who has seen too many thrones fall. "I wish to thank you, monsieur," the king said in excellent French, "for sparing Denmark the scandal of a public trial. The countess was distant family. The count was old nobility. Better that the snow should cover everything." Poirot inclined his head. "Snow melts, sire, but some stains it takes with it." He opened the case. The tiara lay on black velvet like a small lethal constellation. The king looked at it for a long moment, then lifted the hollow center stone between thumb and forefinger, turning it so the light struck the microscopic perforations. "My grandfather wore this at his coronation banquet in 1863, he said quietly. He complained that it made his forehead itch. Perhaps the poison was meant for him, and waited 73 years for a worthier victim. He laid the stone back and closed the lid himself. "It will go into the Rosenborg vault tonight. The mechanism will be destroyed, the diamonds recut. In a generation, no one will remember why the setting was changed. That is the mercy of crowns. They outlive the blood on them." Poirot bowed and took his leave. Outside, the light was already thinning toward lavender. The snow in the palace square had turned to dirty crystal under the wheels of carriages. He walked because walking orders, the thoughts down Bredgate toward the hotel. Halfway there, he paused beneath the bare limes of Kongens Hav and opened the case once more. He removed the pressed gardenia, held it to his nose, still the ghost of tuberose and bitter almonds, then let it fall into the slush, where passing boots would grind it to nothing. Back at the Hotel d'Angleterre, the lobby was almost empty. The English tourists had fled on the first train to Malmö. The servants moved like sleepwalkers, speaking in whispers. Larsen met him at the foot of the grand staircase, cap in hand. "Freya Lindström has confessed everything," he said heavily. "She and the Count planned it for months. He promised her marriage, once the Countess was dead, lied, of course. She kept watch from the roof while he entered through the old service panel behind the wardrobe. She lowered the jewel cases to him on the silk robe. He filled his pockets, then placed the tiara on the sleeping woman's head and waited the 90 seconds. After, he passed the cases back up to her. She hid them in the attic chimney until the storm passed. When Axel began to talk, the Count decided to silence him and blame the curse. Freya went along because she still believed he loved her. Poirot listened without expression. And the nurse? Freya says the Count forced her at gunpoint to write the note, then cut her throat to make it look like remorse. He told Freya it was necessary so their love could be clean. She believed him until he put the revolver in his mouth. Larsen rubbed his eyes. She asked to see you. Poirot hesitated, then nodded once. They had put her in the linen room on the top floor. Ironic choice, surrounded by stacked sheets that smelled of starch and lavender. She sat on a straight chair, wrists cuffed, hair fallen loose, the beauty cracked open like cheap porcelain. When Poirot entered, she did not look up. I want you to know, she said to the floor, that I did love her, in the beginning. Before he told me what she planned to do, give everything to museums, to charities, leave me only an annuity and a cottage in Skagen. He said, we could save the estates, keep the name alive. He said, after we were married, the child would have my eyes. Her voice broke on the last word. Poirot waited. She was asleep, Freya whispered. She looked so peaceful. I watched from the roof. I saw him kiss her forehead after the tiara was in place. I thought it was tenderness. 90 seconds. Less than it takes to boil an egg. She raised her head at last. Will I hang? In Denmark, mademoiselle, women are no longer hanged. You will live a very long time with what you have done. She began to laugh then, the same high breaking sound from the night before, until a police matron led her away, and the laughter dissolved into the smell of bleach and old linen. Downstairs, Poirot found Madame Olga, no Katya, waiting in the porter's office with 2 small suitcases and a passport stamped for Paris via Hamburg. She wore a plain grey coat now, no sable, no veil. She looked like any émigré who had lost the last gamble. I leave on the evening boat, she said. They were kind enough to give me 3rd class. Poirot offered her a cigarette. She took it with fingers that no longer quite trembled. The cipher was never there, she said suddenly. I had the stone x-rayed in Paris last month. Empty. My uncle died in a Parisian garret, believing the fortune waited. There was nothing but platinum and lies. She inhaled, exhaled slowly. All of it, the poison, the substitution, the years of watching, for nothing. Poirot studied her face. And yet you gave the Count the perfect weapon. I gave a greedy man a mirror, she answered. He saw his own reflection and mistook it for destiny. The porter rang the bell for the taxi. She rose, pulled on cheap gloves. Tell me one thing, monsieur. When you looked at the tiara this morning, did the diamonds still tremble? No, Poirot said. They are only stones now. She nodded once, as though that settled something, and walked out into the raw April evening without looking back. Poirot remained in the lobby until the taxi's engine faded toward the harbor. Then he climbed the stairs to the royal suite one final time. The room had been stripped. Only chalk marks on the carpet showed where death had lain. He stood at the window and watched the sun bleed out across the Sound, turning the melting snow to rose and gold. In his pocket, the two center stones clicked softly together, one warm with life, one cold with murder. He would post the true diamond anonymously to the palace. The hollow one he would drop into the sea off Helsingør on his way home, where no brow would ever feel its kiss again. He turned down the lights, closed the door, and left the Hotel d'Angleterre forever. Behind him, the chandelier swung once gently, though no wind touched it, and for an instant the crystals caught the last ray of sun and scattered it across the empty room like a handful of frozen tears finally allowed to fall. Chapter 10. The Little Grey Cells. Triumphant, the train to Hamburg left at dawn the following morning, sliding out of Copenhagen Central beneath a sky rinsed clean of storm and blood. Poirot sat alone in a first-class compartment, valise on the rack, the leather case locked and strapped beside him. A copy of Le Figaro unread on his knee. Outside, the flat Danish fields lay patched with the last dirty snow. Here and there a black rook rose from the stubble like a scrap of burnt paper. He watched them without seeing them. The little grey cells, usually so obedient, were restless, turning over the case the way a dog worries a bone that still holds a trace of meat. He had solved the impossible murder, yes. The locked room had opened its secret like a flower at night. The false paralysis, the service panel behind the wardrobe, the silk rope down the chimney, the tiara transformed into a gas chamber by 18th century ingenuity and 20th century greed. The Count had died by his own hand. Freya would live the rest of her life behind bars. Katia Romanova had vanished into the grey anonymity of exile, and the tiara itself was on its way to a vault where it would trouble no more sleeping brows. Justice, of a sort, had been served cold as aquavit. And yet the taste in Poirot's mouth was not the clean taste of triumph. He took from his waistcoat pocket the hollow center stone. He had not, after all, dropped it into the sound, and turned it between thumb and forefinger. In the pale morning light, the perforations were almost invisible. 36 pinpricks through which death had whispered. He thought of the Countess's face, serene even in cyanide rictus, the faint, amused smile that had never been meant for any living soul. He thought of Freya's broken lullaby, of the Count's last theatrical exit, of a nurse with her throat opened for loyalty. He thought of Katia, walking down the gangplank at Hamburg with 2 cardboard suitcases and a fortune that had never existed. Too many deaths for one small circle of platinum and diamonds, he murmured to the empty compartment, and none of them necessary. The train rattled across the bridge to Sjælland. Gulls wheeled and screamed above the grey water. Poirot slipped the stone back into its chamois pouch, then into the innermost pocket, where it rested against his heart like a cold, poisonous heart that would never beat again. He had decided during the night it would travel with him to Brussels, be dropped through a grating into the deepest canal, and sink unnoticed into the mud where centuries of other secrets lay. The true diamond he had posted from the palace in a plain envelope addressed to the king's private secretary. It would be recut into something harmless, perhaps a brooch for a princess yet unborn. The mechanism would be forgotten, the legend reduced to a footnote in some dusty court memoir. That was the mercy of time. A porter knocked and offered coffee. Poirot accepted, cradling the cup and saucer with the reverence of ritual. The first sip was perfect, bitter, scalding, honest. He allowed himself a small sigh of content. Order and method, he told the steam rising from the cup. Always order and method. But sometimes the order is cruel, and the method leaves the heart bruised. He thought of the gardenia crushed beneath the Countess's heel. Not mockery, he now understood. A message. She had known, perhaps not the precise how, but the who and the why. In her final moments, she had chosen the flower she wore every day, placed it deliberately where it would be found, and smiled because she was, after all, the last true von Rosenkjaer. The tiara had been her crown, the gardenia her signature. She had gone to her ancestors, wearing both, leaving the living to scrabble in the snow for what could never be theirs. The train whistle sounded, long and mournful, as they approached the ferry that would carry them across to Germany. Poirot finished his coffee, folded Le Figaro into precise quarters, and stood to adjust his moustache in the compartment mirror. The face that looked back at him was composed, the green eyes bright, the mouth firm beneath the perfect curves of wax-tipped hair. Only someone who knew him very well indeed would have noticed the faint shadow behind the satisfaction, the knowledge that some victories are too complete, some truths too pitiless. He lifted the leather case, tested the straps once more, and stepped into the corridor as the brakes began their slow scream. On the platform at Rödbyhavn, the air smelled of salt and diesel and the coming spring. He breathed it deeply, tasting freedom from trembling hands and poisoned crowns. "Enough," he said aloud, and the wind off the Baltic carried the word away like absolution. Years later, when people asked Hercule Poirot which of his cases had most tested the little grey cells, he would speak of the Orient Express, or the ABC murders, or the chocolate box with the poisoned strawberry cream. He never mentioned Copenhagen, but sometimes, in the quiet of his London flat, when the fire burned low and the rain whispered against the windows, he would take from a locked drawer a small chamois pouch, open it, and let a hollow diamond roll into his palm. He would hold it to the light, watch the 36 tiny holes catch the flame, and for a moment the room would smell faintly of gardenias and bitter almonds. Then he would return the stone to its pouch, lock the drawer, and pour himself a tisane of vervain. Order would be restored. The past would lie quiet, and somewhere, far to the north, in a glass case at Rosenborg Castle, 36 recut diamonds glittered coldly in a new setting, beautiful, harmless, and utterly silent, keeping their final secret with the patience only stones possess.